Many of you know that before we came to New Jersey, we were in Appalachian, Maryland, far western Maryland. I had two churches out there because one's just not enough. One church was in a small coal mining community, and the other church was a block and a half off of a college campus. And so two churches could not have been more different, but wonderful, lovely places. In Appalachian, Maryland, one of the things that we dealt with on a daily basis was poverty. Not everyone lived in poverty, certainly, but some absolutely did. And because of that, there were many effects. One of them is that a lot of people didn't go anywhere. People stayed right where they were. Not everyone could afford to go on vacation. And so one of the things Karen and I did when we got there is we said we wanted to at least take our youth groups some places. And so we did, I think it was 6 years straight of trips to my mom's house in Ocean City, New Jersey. She was a good sport. She'd always say, "How many are you sending? 7, 8? I'd be like, "Well, 14, 15, and we'd sleep on every couch and floors and all of that and have a terrific time. And at least those first several years, many of the kids that we took, it was the first time they had ever been to the beach. It was the first time they had ever seen the ocean. And it was so much fun to see their faces when they saw the ocean for the first time. One of the other things we did was we gathered with other local Episcopal churches, and just about every year we would go to New York City, to the Cathedral of St. John the Divine, the largest Gothic cathedral in the world. If you haven't gone, you must go. The Statue of Liberty can stand up inside the building, and her torch would not touch the ceiling. It is just incredible. And they have a program for youth that would run the evening. We'd sleep over in the cathedral, and then the next day we would get up and we would explore the city. I always took the youth group with another priest. He was actually my mentor priest, the priest who officiated our marriage. We would take the youth over, and as we would drive over the George Washington Bridge, just when you can start seeing the skyscrapers off in the distance, Father Bo would have a talk every year. And the talk went something like this. He would say, "All right, guys, you are going to see things you've never seen before." He'd say, "You are going to see buildings the size of which you've never seen before." Many of these kids have never been to a city, or maybe once to like Washington on a school field trip or something. They'd never seen a skyscraper before. He'd say, "Don't gawk. Don't stand there with your mouth agape. Look at it, take it in, but don't gawk." And then he would go a little silent and get a little more judicious with his speech, and he would say, "You're also going to see people like you've never seen before. They are going to be dressed in ways that you've never seen before. They are going to be doing things that you've never seen before. Don't gawk." Don't stand there with your mouths open as they walk by. Be cool about it. We can talk about it later. When I drive over the George Washington Bridge, I always hear Father Bo ringing in my ears. The disciples in today's gospel lesson are with Jesus in the big city of Jerusalem. The disciples are country boys. They grew up in the Sea of Galilee. It had towns and some small cities, but nothing large, nothing super impressive, no walled cities, no temples, nothing like that. They were simple country boys. Most of them, as we know, fishermen, farmers, tradesmen, working with their hands. And Jesus takes them to the big city. And I love this gospel lesson. It reminds me of youth groups from Appalachian, Maryland, when the disciples say to Jesus, "Look at the big stones. Look at the big buildings." They obviously didn't have the Father Beau talk because their mouths were certainly agape. And they would have seen big buildings and they would have seen big stones. So this is what, it's coming, what the temple in Jerusalem would have looked like around the time of Jesus. It had just gone through a major renovation project by Herod. Yes, that Herod. He did terrible things, but he was also a big builder, and so he completely rehabbed the temple. That piece in the middle of the courtyard and that tall tower-like thing, that's the temple proper with its courts around it. The temple itself, that tall building there, we think it was around 150 feet high. That's 15 stories in the first century. When those disciples left the Sea of Galilee region and they saw a 15-story high building, no iron girders, no rivets, just stone on top of stone, they would have gawked. There would have been lots of gawking going on. The stones, pretty much, I'll say this again in a moment, the whole temple is destroyed around the year 70. It is all gone, except for a little portion of a retaining wall on the west. It's known as the Western Wall or the Wailing Wall. There's a picture of Pope Francis praying at the Western Wall. You can see him in relation to the size of the stones. Those are big stones being moved around in the first century and then going 15 stories high. So you can see why the disciples would have said to Jesus, "What large stones, what big buildings." And if we had been able to talk to the disciples on that day when they were gawking, and we had asked them, "How long do you think this building is going to last?" they would have said, "Forever." Forever. Yeah. And they would have been as loud as Laurie, right? Forever! They would have been forever. Of course, like, where's this thing is not going anywhere? It is solid. It is huge. Built to the glory of God. And Jesus tells them, there will come a day when not one stone will stand atop another stone. And he was right. And that day wouldn't come 1,000 years later. That day would come less than 40 years later, when the Roman Empire would destroy that temple for the last time. And the instructions given by the emperor were that one stone shall not stand upon another stone. The thing was completely burned and then dismantled. The stones were hauled away. And then the Roman Empire came back and they scraped the top 10 to 20 feet off of Temple Mount so the Jewish people wouldn't even have the soil that the temple used to stand on. When Mark writes this gospel, the gospel that we heard today and what we've been reading through most of the last year, he wrote it around the year 70, the same year the temple is destroyed. Mark's first audience, the first people that would have heard the words of the gospel read aloud, would have remembered going to Jerusalem and seeing that 150-foot tower and those massive stones. They would have remembered thinking to themselves, this thing's going to be here forever. And then they could walk to the same Temple Mount and see that it was completely gone. What Jesus is basically saying here when he says to them, you see these great buildings, they're not going to last. What he's saying is you can't trust in the building. If you put your trust in the building, your trust is going to be gone in 40 years. Don't trust in great stones and tall edifices. He then goes on right after that and says that you can't always trust people. He said, people will come to you and say all sorts of things. They will come to you and say that I am he, and the end is coming, and they'll tell you when the end will arrive and all that. And he said, don't listen to them. Don't be led astray. In fact, he uses that word twice. We can't trust in buildings. And sometimes we can't trust people. And we hear those words from the good book. But we also know those words to be true from our own experience. I mean, is there an institution or an organization in our lifetime that has not let us down in the last 100 years? 20 years? We cannot always put our faith in buildings or in people. And we hear that to be true, but I think we also know that to be true. And so if Jesus is saying don't trust in the buildings and don't always trust in people, who is he saying that we should trust? God, obviously. And yet, as obvious as that is, it's also hard because that building was built for God. Right? Those people that Jesus is talking about that are going to be coming and saying, I am he, and I know things that you don't know, and I know secrets that you have not heard about. Those people are going to be coming in the name of God too. They're going to say that they're speaking for God. So just trusting in God is not always as obvious as we might think it is. You read a little bit further in the New Testament, you get to the first epistle of John, and John there speaks at length about discernment of spirits, what is of God and what isn't of God. And we are not to take the things of God lightly, but to think about them. Is this really something or someone that I can trust in? How I might put it is that to put our faith in God means to put our faith in truth. To put our faith in God means to put our faith, our trust in love, real love. To put our faith in God means to put our faith in justice. To put our faith in God means to put our faith and trust into something that is rooted in hope and compassion and grace and mercy. A temple to truth may fall down. A cathedral to love might disintegrate. A house of compassion might go bankrupt and derelict. But truth and love and compassion themselves never will. And when we find truth, when we find compassion, when we find love, when we find real justice and mercy and grace, perhaps we could do away with the words of Father Bow and stand there and gape in amazement at the real glory of God.